Hi, I'm going to go ahead and begin. My name is Dr. Silvia Costa. I am the CEO of the YWCA El Paso del Norte region. I want to thank all of you that are joining us today for this very important conversation on race. The mission of the YWCA is to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. It's a mission that we take very seriously at the YWCA, and the YWCA in El Paso has been around for 111 years. So we have been focused on changing our community and working with our communities for over 100 years. Currently, the YWCA offers racial justice programming within our different areas. So we have a racial justice program within our early learning academies, as well as our after school programs and in our teen leadership programs. So it's, we're very excited about having all of you here today. Before we begin, I wanna make sure that everybody understands the rules and the guidelines. First of all, profane, hateful, racist, or discriminatory language will not be tolerated. Be respectful of each panelist, the moderator, and other participants. Personal attacks of panelists or other participants will not be tolerated. Anyone whose comments or participation is deemed to be counterproductive, not in the spirit of the event, or as violating these guidelines will be removed from the webinar. So thank you so much. I will now turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Ann Horak, who is on the board of YWCA USA. She is also on the board of YWCA El Paso del Norte, and she is an associate professor of practice at the University of Texas at El Paso. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to my good friend and board member, Dr. Ann Horak. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. And I just want to make clear the guidelines that Sylvia was sharing. These refer to the chat and the question and answer room. So those of you who are participating in the chat or the Q&A space, we'd love to have your comments as long as they follow all of the rules that have been laid out. So thank you for joining us tonight. We have a really distinguished and very well informed panel with us tonight. We have Dr. Michael Williams. He is a professor of history at the University of Texas at El Paso, as well as the director of our African American Studies program. We have Sade Talabi. She is a history major at UTEP, and she's minoring in African American Studies. She is also the president of the Black Student Union at UTEP. We have Jamie Flores. Jamie is the executive director of the El Paso Holocaust Museum. And we have State Senator Jose Rodriguez. He represents our El Paso in the state Senate. And before he was elected to that office in 2010, he served as our El Paso County Attorney for 17 years. So we are very fortunate tonight to have people who can speak to these issues from a variety of perspectives and points of knowledge, as well as personal life experience. Thank you all panelists for joining us. These last few days and weeks, we have all been very shaken by the images we've seen, the video of the murder of George Floyd, as well as the images afterwards of the various activist activities, the marches and the protests. I want to start our event tonight by asking each of you just to reflect on what you've seen and how you're feeling in this moment. And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Williams.
Hey, well, thank you. First of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and be a part of this panel. The question of how I feel is a question that's been asked quite often. It's a question that I ask my two daughters, how do you feel? And they live over 1,000 miles from here. But that's a question that I constantly ask. When I think about what I saw with Mr. George Floyd, it's kind of an emotional feeling as well. And I'm going to be honest. You had the initial impact of anger, of concern, of dread, of frustration. But then it also was this feeling of the need to make sure that you are also responsible for responding to what had happened. Now, my mother and father taught us all, and I've got 7 sisters and 3 brothers, that we were responsible for addressing the injustices that we see. And so when I saw the funeral as well, and I saw the pain that his family experienced when they talked about what Mr. Floyd meant to them and their cries for justice, I felt another renewed sense of responsibility to make sure that I'm doing everything that I can to address these kinds of issues. And so when you ask about how you feel, that's a range of those feelings. But when you also see the response that people had to that, this notion that it's time out for injustices that are all over society, when you see that too, that also brings up a broad range of feelings. And so those are the kinds of things that went across my mind, this self-reflection too of purpose, and how do you continue this type of movement so that you make sure that you're doing everything you're supposed to be doing. So it was a range of feelings, but those were primarily ones that drive me.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Sade, what about you? What are some of your reactions and feelings?
Definitely piggybacking off of what Dr. Williams is saying, it's definitely hurtful, and it's sad to see a man lose his life because of something so just stupid, frankly, and awful. But at the same time, I always say it's like a bittersweet thing, because now you've seen, or we've all seen, the changes that have been happening and the laws being passed, and attitudes changing since the unfortunate event of his death. So yeah, I definitely say it's bittersweet, because you see young people using their voice, people 13, 14 using their voice out in the streets, doing protests, going to rallies, using their voice to, sign petitions and tell their friends to finally wake up and, try to make change. So it's definitely a bittersweet kind of feeling.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And Jamie, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, I would echo what has already been said of that range of emotions of feeling anger, despair, sometimes hopelessness, that how is this still being fought in 2020? How is this still happening? But also seeing that this has really, this injustice, this most recent injustice has really propelled our country, I think, into demanding change and drawing groups of people together that maybe have not normally joined the fight. It hasn't been their fight in the same way before. And that's been so inspiring to me, to see people across the country, across the world, joining in from all different races and religions and ethnicities. And that has been really inspiring, and has impressed on me the responsibility, as Dr. Williams said, that every single one of us has, that this is everyone's fight, that we all play a very pivotal role at this time.
Thank you. Senator Rodriguez, what are your thoughts and feelings at this time?
Well, like the others, the range of emotions. Initially, on viewing what was done to George Floyd, sheer outrage, incredible outrage to see yet again another video of yet again another police killing of an African American, and just anger that here we are after all these years and this is still happening in America. On the other hand, as has already been stated, I also felt much inspiration by all of the movements that have launched across the country, including here in El Paso, inspired by not only the efforts to try to bring about some reforms in the criminal justice system, especially with regard to policing in this country, but also on a much broader scale to hopefully once and for all address systemic racism, racism that is either intentional or that emanates from systems that we have in place that discriminate against African Americans, against Latinos, other peoples of color, certainly against Native Americans. And it's something that needs our attention. And so I'm really heartened by all of the debates and discussion that is taking place, and how informative some of these have been, and how just today I had a meeting with 2 former police officers getting their views of how things transpired here in El Paso. And it was a very educational session that we had. And I think that's what we need to do. I think we need to unleash our creativity, our innovative impulses to address policing in this country, including here in El Paso, and also to try to bring about some reforms in the systemic racism that we see day in and day out.
Okay, thank you all for sharing. And now I want to ask some specific questions to each of you based on kind of the areas of your expertise and lived experience. And Dr. Williams, I'm going to start with you. You talked about, you know, the anger and the frustration and the need for the cries for justice. This is we don't have time for you to fully answer this question in the ways that you should, but can you just kind of ground us a little bit in, you know, the history of racism in El Paso, and the history of racism in America, and how we got to the place where we are right now?
Well, yeah, I mean, when you start talking about the history of racism in America, that's a large discussion. But you have to, in order to discuss racism in America, you have to discuss it from a systemic standpoint, and to realize that it is an intricate part of this country's past and its present. And it's been here all the time. This idea of creating separation among people, you have inferior, quote unquote, inferior people. This goes all the way back. And that's what allowed this country to do what it did to the Native Americans in terms of taking their land and killing them indiscriminately. This is what allowed this country to engage in enslaving African people and all of the brutalities that went along with that. Because in society's mind, you were dealing with a group of individuals who were less than human. And so that allowed you to do what it is you wanted to do with them. That's an important part of systemic racism, is that it categorized people into different subgroups in terms of inferiority, which then has awful consequences for people of color in many instances. Also, when you're looking at this, even after slavery ended, there was then a rush to codify this idea of inferiority and racism. And so you had Black Code laws, you had Jim Crow laws, you had segregation, you had second-class citizenship. You had all these things that allowed society to oppress people of color. You also had medical experimentations upon African Americans, upon women. All right, so you had all these kinds of things as a part of a larger system of racism and oppression. Right? And so if you don't look at it from a systemic standpoint, to get a real understanding and grounding of what racism actually means and the consequences for it, then you lose the momentum of the discussion altogether. And it runs the gamut in terms of consequences. So basically, in terms of when you're looking at racism and discussing it, you have to look at the totality of it and why it exists as an institution. That's the only way you're going to be able to address the issues that result from it. And so that's what I see when you start talking about institutional racism or racism in America. You have to look at it from that broad perspective and then drill down.
Thank you. Sade, you mentioned that you feel like young people are finding their voice and using their voice. As a UTEP student, as an African-American UTEP student, how do you feel young people view racism? Do they view it differently than older people? And what are some of the things that your organization does, or what are some of the things that you're seeing young people in general in the US, across the world, do in this time to respond to racism?
I think the way young people see race today is not necessarily different because racism hasn't changed. The premise of racism and people hating you because of your skin color has not changed. But the way older generations have viewed it and we have viewed it has been very different, because we have technology and we see, growing up, we've seen Black men and women being killed by police brutality on film, on television, on huge network sites like CNN, like Fox News. So we definitely grew up seeing that. And I think the fight that young people have now has been obviously elevated forward because of the work past generations did for us. Older generations were fighting for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Act. They were fighting for basic freedoms. And because they did the work they did for us, we have the right to fight hard, not harder per se, but we have the right to fight more and do more. So I think that's the difference. But as for the BSU at UTEP, we try to farther our education into Black studies as a group, as a collective. We try to gain business knowledge and leadership skills. We go to conferences every semester that teach us about, you know, togetherness and pride in who you are, pride in being Black, gaining leadership knowledge, and networking with different schools and different people to further our knowledge. We try to do fundraising activities around the community and, you know, different stuff like that to just make sure that people know at UTEP there's a sense of collectiveness and there's a place for Black people. And it's not just for Black students. We say to everyone who wants to join, if you're an ally, you're more than welcome, because this is a place where people, you know, have good intentions, and we want our good intentions to show all over the campus. So that's basically what we do.
Thank you. Jamie, you spoke about, you know, how is this still happening in 2020? And you teach about a historical time, the Holocaust, when, you know, anti-Semitism had been happening for thousands of years before that historical event and continues to happen. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about the issue of privilege, of people from different parts of life having more privilege than others, and how that can be used positively. I know, for example, you know, Sade just mentioned allies. You know, what makes a good ally? And I know, for example, at the Holocaust Museum, you all like to use the term upstander instead of bystander. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. That's an amazing question. And it's what we try to do at the museum is we use the Holocaust as this framework for looking at contemporary and social issues today, because it really does show the depths that humankind can sink to. It is this example in our history of man's ultimate inhumanity to man, of this othering of a group of people who before had been citizens, but were demonized and dehumanized to the point where they were mass eliminated. And there was this great number, millions of people were bystanders, chose to not speak out, to take a back seat. It didn't affect them personally, so it was so much easier to just stand by and watch, and maybe thought that's a terrible thing, but it doesn't affect me personally, so I can't get involved, I can't risk it. That's an easy decision to be a bystander. But Annie mentioned the term upstander, and it's what we try to instill in visitors in the museum, is that can be a tough choice to stand up against evil, to stand up against injustice. But it is only through people who choose to do that change can ever happen, that hate can ever be ended. So the upstanders during the Holocaust were ordinary men and women who saw what was happening to their Jewish friends, Jewish neighbors, even strangers, and said, I can do something. It might cost me everything, but I can do something. I can be a voice for the voiceless. I can be a safe haven for someone who's persecuted, to be that true ally, and to stand up with others. They were heroes just because they did the right thing, and only because they knew it was the right thing to do. They stood against that tyranny, that hate. They refused to stay silent. And I think that's really a very powerful lesson for us today, for those very few voices. I mean, in the sea of bystanders and collaborators that allowed hate to run unchecked across Europe, for those very few, their voices might have been small, but they were mighty, and they succeeded in saving lives and standing up for righteousness. And we remember those names today because of the lives they saved and the difference that they made. So we really try at the museum to connect that to today, to tell our visitors, many of them may not be personally connected to this history or to things going on today, but to share that message of, you know, you may not think it's your fight, but it is your fight. If you are part of humanity, if you're part of the human race, then when one person is persecuted, we all are persecuted. Where there is injustice, someplace is injustice against us all. And I just wanted to end with this really powerful quote by Elie Wiesel. That's he's a Holocaust survivor, and after enduring so much hatred and persecution and loss, he came out of the Holocaust as a champion for those who are being persecuted. And this quote by him has just been on my heart and my mind so much lately. And he says, "We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe." I think that's so telling for the times that we're living in right now.
Thank you. That's a very powerful quote. Senator Rodriguez, you talked about, you know, just your sense of anger at outrage of seeing yet another video of yet another police officer killing yet another African American. And you also talked about the need for reform in policing and in legislation. We asked our participants to submit questions before tonight's event. And there's a question from Christine who is asking about what type of training do law officers get in El Paso and elsewhere? And what kind of failures have you seen in policing, police training, or in legislation that has brought us to this place today?
Well, first of all, the first part of the question about what type of training, we have in Texas an agency, TCLOS it's called for short, that prescribes standardized training for all police departments, both city and county and constables, anybody that wears a badge. And that kind of training is pretty extensive. Day before yesterday at City Council, it was mentioned that we have to go by the training that is dictated by that state agency, training agency for police officers. That's not right. Cities can mandate training for their officers that exceeds the standards that have to be met for the statewide training requirements. And that's important because, for example, a lot of people are talking about training people to learn how to de-escalate rather than to escalate confrontations. And there's many other principles, you know, the use of chokeholds, the use of what are supposedly non-lethal methods of crowd control, crowd dispersal, like bean bags, rubber bullets. All of those have been shown across the country to actually kill people. So there's a need to really revamp the training that's provided to police officers, especially with regard to the critical moment when they feel that they have to use force, excessive force. That's part of what's going on in the discussion. Now, your second part of the question is about what kind of legislation has failed. And there's been plenty. My first year in the Senate, in the Texas Senate in 2011, I served on the Criminal Justice Committee. And there were plenty of bills introduced, including some by me, to provide more transparency, more oversight over policing practices. And a lot of those bills simply don't make it out of the Texas legislature. It's a very conservative state that we live in, and the police unions are very strong here in the state, covered by the umbrella organization, CLEAT, Combined Law Enforcement Officers Association. So anytime you want to pass anything, for example, prohibiting racial profiling, requiring that there be more data and reporting of numbers of people that were racially profiled, those kinds of things don't get past the hearing stage. And so there are so many bills, including bills to ban chokeholds, bills to require police to be more reoriented towards de-escalation, bills that would require new training for officers at the state level. And we haven't been able to get very far with that. One of the key things that I am very interested in is a bill that Senator Rodney Ellis, former senator, now county commissioner in Houston, used to introduce, and that's to require statewide an independent civilian review board to investigate police misconduct and other policing practices. That's one of the recommendations I made to City Council on Monday, that they ought to consider doing that, because all we have now are, and across the state, advisory citizen committees, and those are just advisory. They're under the control of the police department. They're appointed by the police department, not by the elected officials like the City Council. And so it seems to me that's important legislation, both at the state level and at the local level, because we do have the authority of City Council to establish these kinds of civilian review boards independent of the police. And I think that would go a long ways towards feeling a lot more trust in our police department. But it's a tough issue. It's been fought by the police department. It's been brought up before, and it's never really been implemented. And so I could spend a lot of time on legislation to promote more transparency, more reporting, releasing videos of critical incidents. Our own state representative, Joe Moody, has worked on that legislation, but we haven't been able to get over the hump. Now, as a result of all of this discussion that we're having across the country on some of these issues and policing practices, I am thinking that there may be a different response in the next session of the legislature to these types of bills that come up.
Thank you. And several of you mentioned that we don't have the time to go into these issues as in depth as we need to, and that is true. So tonight hopefully is the beginning of conversations that will continue and that people will continue to do learning on their own. To continue with some of the questions that we received ahead of tonight's event, both Richard and Tayshandal submitted a question asking about El Paso. And sometimes we think of El Paso, we talk about El Paso exceptionalism or the bubble that El Paso is, that we don't have the racism that we have in other cities. But many El Pasoans, in fact, do suffer from discrimination and racist acts. And I would just like each of you to take some time to respond to what you see and hear and feel and know about our own city, the racism that we have in our own city. And again, I'm going to start with you, Dr. Williams.
All right, thank you. And you're right in terms of this notion of discrimination and racism that happens here. There is this belief that El Paso is somehow immune from racism. That's not the case. I spend a lot of time, as I teach, like I said, at the university, but a lot of students come into my office, particularly African-American students, and they talk about the problems that they've had. in terms of racial profiling with interactions with police, how they treated in these interactions. They talked to me about how it feels when they are in stores and they are walked or followed up and down the aisles until they feel so uncomfortable that they have to leave, and then they'll watch as they're in the parking lot. They talk about being asked to leave certain businesses for no apparent reason whatsoever. They talk about the lack of employment opportunities in which they are there and people tell them, well, we don't want to hire you all because you all don't want to work, or you don't show up on time, or you can only do certain types of jobs, right? And how that feels. They talk to me about how they're represented in textbooks sometimes, in the educational system, in terms of how Black people are presented. Right? I also have many students who come in and talk about how they are viewed outside of the institution itself and just in society as a whole in El Paso with the things that they're trying to do. So we hear all these kinds of things that students are talking to me about, and colleagues as well, with their interactions with police officers or being racially profiled, those things. So yes, El Paso isn't immune to it. We have these kinds of issues, and these are just issues like everything else have to be addressed and looked in the larger scheme of systemic racism.
Thank you. What about you, Sade? What are your thoughts on El Paso and how these issues affect our city?
Like Dr. Williams said, there's racism everywhere. No place is immune to racism. I will say, growing up, I grew up the first part of my life in New York, and then we moved to Houston. So both of those places are very culturally diverse. There's a lot of Black people, Asian people, Hispanic people everywhere. And I will say moving to El Paso definitely made me notice microaggressions more. As an African-American person, it's sad, but it's kind of a cliche that we have to get used to when we walk into stores and, you notice that the employees start to follow you and whoever you're with, or when you're at checkout at Walmart, for example, you notice that employees tend to watch you a little bit more than they do everyone else. And, simple microaggressions like asking to touch someone's hair, or asking if hair is real, saying things like you speak so eloquently, or you're so well versed. So I've definitely experienced it in El Paso. I've never experienced an outright racist attack of any kind, physically, verbally, and I'm very lucky to that extent. But I definitely have experienced many microaggressions, like I'm sure a lot of other African Americans have too as well.
Thank you. Another topic that we could definitely spend a lot of time talking about. Jamie, how do you see this play out in our city?
Well, a few years ago at the museum, we actually had a discussion on this led by Dr. Horak to talk about racism in El Paso. And a lot of questions we got were racism, El Paso, and then others began to share stories and their experiences here. And I learned so much, and it really broadened my understanding of, as I said, microaggressions, and the even here in El Paso, that racism is institutionalized and systemic, so much so that we can almost pretend it's not there, not recognize it for what it really is. And until we stop denying that it's there and start to listen to other people's experiences, it's easy to just ignore that it's such a reality here as well. Some of the stories that I heard really broadened my view on this and really shook me of experiences that people had going into stores, and the things that have been said, and it really did shake me to hear that from people that I cared about. And I will never forget when one of my very dear friends during this event, or before the event, sorry, told me about her experiences here, and that even here in El Paso, the talks that she had to have with her sons, her fear when they left the house, how worried she was when they were late to come home, everything they had to go through to make sure that they were safe. And it hit me so hard, because I thought, those are talks I will not have to have with my kids. Those are talks my parents didn't have to have with me. And I knew before that this was a horrible reality in our country, but for some reason I thought El Paso was a little bit safer than that. And that was a huge wake-up call for me that no place is safe from racism. We do have a great community. There are wonderful parts of this community, but it is not always equally great and equally safe for everyone here.
Thank you for sharing that. Senator, you've lived and served in El Paso for a long time. Share what your thoughts are on this issue.
Well, I grew up in South Texas, but I've been in El Paso for over 37 years, having married a native El Paso woman, Carmen, my wife. I would like to kind of point out not specific examples as the others have described, because I think they're giving it pretty good coverage. I want to just remind us that El Paso was part of the Confederacy. When the state decided to join the Confederacy, El Paso went along with it. We had the Ku Klux Klan here in El Paso. We in more modern times had segregation like in other parts of the country, segregated schools. You had Douglas School for African Americans. You had the Lincoln Center over there by the Spaghetti Bowl was for Mexican kids, Mexican Americans. And so there's plenty of examples of how we have a history of discrimination and racist attitudes here in this place, as well as in other places. On the other hand, I'd like to point out proudly how I have learned that El Paso was at the forefront of the civil rights movement. It was the first in the state to desegregate public housing, to desegregate the schools, to public accommodations. Dr. Nixon, an African-American doctor, challenged a lot of the Jim Crow laws that kept African Americans and minorities from participating in the electoral process. So we have much to be proud of in being leaders in that area. The desegregation of schools, there was a decision in El Paso before Brown versus Board of Education, by 2 years at least, as I recall, Dr. Williams. And that tells you how advanced El Paso was compared to other places. But even though we are a community that is viewed universally, that from people that come from the outside, like military folks and others, as being a very friendly city, and racism and discrimination is not as stark as it is in other places in the country. Nevertheless, as has already been pointed out, there are plenty of incidents of racist attitudes expressed here in our community.
Thank you. Dr. Williams, you mentioned, that you are a professor at UTEP and you talk to students a lot, and sometimes you have conversations about things like the ways in which they are represented in textbooks. So I want to ask now, what are some of your thoughts about what did you learn growing up about American history that you felt was lacking? And what do you wish we were teaching to our young people today, either in the K through 12 system or in the university system, to give them that broader sense of history, American history, who Americans are, and to help with some of the issues that we're still struggling with now in 2020?
So if I understand your question, you're talking about the issue of race?
Well, and the educational system, like what did you learn growing up? What were your textbooks look like? And what would you like to see in the educational system today around race?
Okay, well, this is going to be a different kind of take because I have 7 sisters, like I say, and 3 brothers, and we all were homeschooled. And so we went through a home educational program that was designed not only to teach us the academic side, but to also teach us the kind of cultural history of who we were as a people, who we were as African people, what those values were. And so we spent a lot of time understanding that and what the history of American society in terms of the racial aspect, the racial attitudes. And also the books, the textbooks that we use were highly Afrocentric in terms of how they approach this notion of societal development. Right? So my education was a lot different than others. What's missing oftentimes in the educational system, however, is the truth about people of color in terms of their history and their narrative and their contributions to society, you know, and in terms of how society has treated them. And we see that still in textbooks in terms of the criminalization of people of color. Right? So we see that. We see these types of things in the classrooms that are taught. When you talk about African American history in many schools, it's a small section that looks at slavery, the civil rights, and then you're done. Right? And then we have students who talk about that, who come to my class and say, I've never had the opportunity to get an extended look at African American history, right? In terms of society as a whole. Right? And so when we look at how America is being presented in terms of history, it's always sort of an exceptionalism look at the American story without properly taking into account the experiences and the narratives of people of color and the oppression that's there. Right? And that again goes back to the notion of systemic racism and how that plays into things. Right? The idea of the educational system, the judicial system, you know, all of that is a part of it. The television that we watch, society as a whole, all that is a part of what goes on. And so I grew up challenging that kind of image, that type of education, you know, that says that America was at the height of everything and there was no problems with it. Right? And so that's what I think should be taught too. The problems, the real true problems of American society and how people have struggled to correct those issues. Right? These progresses that we're talking about, that's the thing about it. There's a lot of progress, but these progress we're talking about didn't just happen overnight. It was people who struggled and fought for that. As the senator brings up here, in El Paso, you have people who, like Dr. Nixon, who have worked and struggled and sacrificed and did all of those things, but yet you still have the problems still exist today, which makes it even more problematic. So those are the things that I'm talking about when I grew up learning. Yes, understand American history, understand America's position in society, understand what America has done, but also understand the problems that come along with it, and those problems still exist. And so those are the things that need to be taught, you know, in terms of that, in order for us to get a full understanding. This is one thing you all said, this is a dialogue about race. Everything is a dialogue. And in order to have a full dialogue, you have to come to the table prepared to talk about everything, all of the issues, and how people have struggled in it. And so that's kind of the position that I come from. So when I grew up, that's what we were taught. And then we went off and we did the things that we know we needed to do to address issues of injustices and speak truth to power. All right? There's so much more I can say to that, but I'm just going to stop it right there. But that's kind of how I see it.
Thank you. And thank you for those powerful words. We need to be willing to talk about everything or we're not going to move forward. Even the things that make us uncomfortable, we've got to be able to talk about it all. Sade, you said that one of the things that the BSU, the Black Student Union, does at UTEP is try to educate about Black history, about Black lives, and also educate to bring forth a feeling of pride. So how would you respond to that question? What did you grow up learning and what do you feel like was missing? What do you wish were being taught today?
I grew up not learning what I should have been learning, for sure. I feel like US history, especially Texas history, tends to be glazed over. We don't dive deep inside of, you know, the issues at hand. We learn so-and-so is a hero and so-and-so is this, and the third, and this is why we should like this person, but we don't know what this person actually did when it comes to people of color, what they did to get to the top. We don't learn those kind of things. And it was because of what I didn't know in school that I wanted to become a history major. So much of the things I learned made me want to teach other kids in high school or younger about what we don't know and what we should know. So definitely growing up, I didn't know enough. And I'm glad for the teachers in my life that taught me the truth and what I should know. But yeah, like you were saying, in BSU, we try to do the same thing. We want people to come to BSU not to just have fun and to meet new people and to engage, but we want to also teach like this is what really happened. This is what you don't know. This is what you should know when it comes to Black history, African history, the connection between the two, and everything in between. So definitely definitely didn't learn what I should have learned or enough, but yeah.
But you're going to become the teacher who teaches.
Yeah, to try to teach people those things.
Jamie, you said that hearing stories from people different than you was a real wake-up call. You know, how could our education system be that kind of wake-up call? What's your response to this question about, you know, what you learn and what we should be teaching?
It's such an important question because so much of that starts in the classroom. And I was fortunate to grow up with parents who instilled that in me, of the that all people should be treated with respect and dignity. All people are created equally, and I'm grateful I had that as a foundation, because going into school, as everyone has already mentioned, it's a very whitewashed view that you get of history, and it just really touches on these key pivotal parts of history. You know, the Holocaust is a sentence in a lot of textbooks. We learned about slavery and the civil rights movement and the end. And that's such a disservice, not only to the student, but there's such larger ramifications, because it means that we as a country have not reconciled ourselves to our own history. These hundreds of years of oppression and discrimination of minority groups, of Native Americans, of African Americans. This has been going on for so long, and for a large part of our country, we have not we have not recognized that is a very dark part of our history, and taking responsibility for that helps us to move forward. And I think that does keep us tied to the past when we refuse to recognize how horrific it was, and that is our history too. So now looking back and seeing that I was in a bubble for so long, not knowing, because I had not experienced it personally, and it wasn't until I got to college, and I also was a history major, so I started learning and trying to understand this much richer, deeper, larger context. And I think that is so important for our education system today, to broaden our perspectives, to bring in a diversity of voices and perspectives, and not just learn about it as a quick, oh yes, this was the African American experience back then, and that's it. That's not the end of the story. This is an ongoing thing that we must be teaching our students. And I think many educators are doing that, and they are trying to take the limited amount they have in their textbooks and expound on that and help their students to understand other voices and perspectives. It's a big job for educators to do. So I think we all have a role in that as well, to help that education of our young people. So it's not just on a few, it's on all of us.
Thank you. Senator Rodriguez, you just gave us a little bit of a history lesson of some of the history about El Paso that we sometimes want to brush under the rug, and some of the history of El Paso that we could be more proud of. How do you respond to this question? What kind of things did you learn? What should we be teaching people today?
Well, like the others, I feel that, and this is the fact, that in this state, history has not been taught about the contributions of African Americans, about Latinos, about women, and others. It just is across the board. It was only last year that our State Board of Education approved a textbook for Mexican American studies here in the 21st century. and without those kinds of books, whether it be Mexican American history and contributions or African American history and contributions, we grow up not realizing what our peoples have gone through and what they have contributed in spite of those tremendous challenges of racism and discrimination. And it has deprived many of us from having a deeper appreciation, especially young people, of their particular uh, uh, group, whether it's the Latino or African American. And I would argue that it has also deprived the white students of an appreciation for the contributions of the minority of people of color around them, and which in my view has contributed to maintaining these practices of discrimination. And certainly you see it in the legislative arena. The voter ID law was found to be intentionally discriminatory by federal courts of appeal, including a court up in Washington, D.C. of 3 judges, 2 Republicans and a Democrat. And there's many other pieces of legislation that have been found to be discriminatory and intentionally discriminatory. So it continues to this day. It's unfortunate. I am always amazed when I learn, for example, of the Black women that were involved with the NASA program in developing, our trip out to the moon. And who knew that? If a movie hadn't come out, I mean, I don't recall seeing anything like that in our textbooks when I was a kid. So we have a ways to go in terms of providing a more well-rounded and accurate picture of different peoples, their contributions, the fact that our folks have been fighting in all of these wars, all the way back to the Revolutionary War and the founding of this country, the Civil War, and World War I and II, and so forth. One example, Marcelino is a man who was the most highly decorated soldier out of World War I. He actually came to us from Juarez and came to El Paso, and he volunteered at the age of 17 to go fight. He was undocumented, and they knew that, and they let him in because they needed more men. And it's only recently that people, including myself, learned about him. And as a result, the new international bridge over there by Tornillo is named after him. And these are the kinds of things that growing up, we never knew. So it's important. It's important to have a more accurate picture and sense of history and what our contributions have been by the respective peoples in our part of the world.
Thank you for that. As I mentioned earlier, we received a lot of excellent questions ahead of tonight's event. So thank you for all of those questions that were submitted, and we were not able to get to all of them. I do want to just do a couple more questions and pick one from the questions that are being submitted tonight. And again, we're not going to be able to get to all of them tonight. But April brings up the point that El Paso was itself a target of a white supremacist hate and attack on August the 3rd. And Jocelyn says that she sometimes gets pushback as a Latina for supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. So I kind of want to ask each of you to reflect upon, is the Black Lives Matter movement, or is the actions that we're seeing today in response to the killing of George Floyd, in response to the many other killings that we've seen, is that just a Black issue, or is that an issue for other people to get involved in? And I'd like to again to start with you, Dr. Williams, in your response to that. You're on mute still.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is these are things that are happening to Black people, and it's something that's been happening for generations, since the very beginning. Right? So when you see Black Lives Matter movement and you see people addressing the issues, they're addressing these issues because it has happened to us specifically. Right? Now, does that mean that other people can't get involved in? Absolutely not, because we have to all struggle against this notion of injustice and inequality, because we all are tainted by it. All right? And so, no, it's not just the Black movement, but it's a movement that is spearheaded because it affects Black people. George Floyd was Black. And what happened to him? You know, Ahmaud Arbery was Black. Breonna Taylor was Black, right? So these are the issues. Just like historically, when people look back historically on the issues that impact them, they are the ones who are spearheaded. Now, there's been Black-Brown solidarity in the struggle from the beginning. So you have that, right? So you have allies who come in and support your movement. Right? And so when people, so you can't just look at it and say, well, okay, this is just a Black movement, and so we don't have anything to do with it, or Black people are the only ones engaged in it. But yes, we are at the forefront of these issues because it impacts us. It impacts our communities, right? It impacts our children, right? When these things happen, I have to talk to my daughters about what they're feeling about. I have to make sure that they understand how society views them. Same thing with my brothers. So we have to be educated about these issues. And so when these things come out, we combat them. And then other people, because you are in touch with your humanity, you see that as well, and you say, I have to speak against it as well, and vice versa. When I saw here that was going on with people who are locked in cages under the bridge, my humanity would not let me ignore that. When I see what was going on across this nation, my humanity won't let me ignore that. So that's the part that I focus on as well, with these issues that affect African Americans, that affect Black people. That's how I come at it.
Thank you for that. Thank you for those powerful words. Sade, how about you? Do you see this as an issue for Black people only, or for other people to get involved in?
I feel like there's no one who should see something like this as an issue for only Black people. I don't understand how people can see someone lose their lives on television because of a police officer kneeling on their neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and not think, I should be enraged by this, or I need to go out and help, or I need to fight with these people to do something to make sure this doesn't happen. And I think a lot of people's problem is the fact that the name is Black Lives Matter, when in reality, all we're saying is Black Lives Matter as well, also, too. It's not saying that all lives do not matter. The point of Black Lives Matter is saying, include us. Like, yes, we know, obviously we know all lives do matter, but we're protesting because we see Black men and women being killed over and over and over, and we see no repercussions for the officers who did the injustices. One thing I want people to take away that's most important is that allyship is the strongest thing we have. Like, we've seen over the past 2 weeks, so many things have changed in different cities. We've seen the Minneapolis Police Department disbanded their police force. There's cities who are granting money to start civilian task force. We've seen chokeholds be outlawed. So obviously you see that working together is making a difference. So honestly, I don't see how someone can say, you know, I can just watch this and not do anything to help make change.
Thank you. Thank you for those words. Jamie, how about you? How would you respond to that?
Oh, it's already been so well stated. But I think when we say that we find a problem with Black Lives Matter, with the phrasing of that, and somehow think that means someone is saying all lives, other lives do not matter, that's completely missing the point. We need this movement because there is still such a problem here. If we didn't have the problem, we wouldn't need this movement. But because we do, and because we need this change, this is a very, very necessary and powerful movement, and something that I don't see, as has been stated, I don't see how you cannot get behind something so important and so powerful. And as has also been said, you know, we have to start with acknowledging that we have a problem. We have an inequality here in this country. And just because it may not personally affect someone, it may not personally affect you, you're not absolved of responsibility. You don't then not have a role. That's happened for far too long, and that's why we still have this going on, is it has been, it's not my problem, I don't have to get involved. This is everybody's fight and everybody's struggle, because how else are we going to have change, and how else will we truly have equality in this country? So I don't understand that why somebody might feel that way, but I think that's part of the struggle as well, is showing that this is a humanity issue. This is recognizing, as Dr. Williams said, the humanity in one another.
Thank you. Senator, how about you?
Well, I am heartened by the fact that when you look at the reports for the last 2 weeks of all of these gatherings, demonstrations, protests, that it is now a total mix of different peoples, different colors, different races. Everybody understands now what it means when people say Black Lives Matter, because everyone feels the humanity that Jamie was talking about, that we cannot allow any member of our society, regardless of their color, to be treated in that way, to have their rights violated, to be executed in the manner that George Floyd was, and many of the others that Dr. Williams mentioned. So I think that those people who say, well, Black Lives Matter is a black thing, are completely missing the significance of that movement, which has now absorbed and incorporated so many different peoples and responses, not just in Minnesota, not just in this country, and not just here in El Paso, but all across the world. And I am really heartened by the work that has been done by the young people that started Black Lives Matter, and how they have persisted after Ferguson in doing organizing and being vigilant of what's happening to African Americans throughout this nation. And now with George Ferguson's case, it's no longer just an African American issue. It's an issue for all of us as members of the human race. And so I'm very heartened by what I see on the screens of the leaders of Black Lives Matter leading some of these diverse cross-cultural groups of people from different walks of life in the country.
Thank you, Senator. I want to end tonight. The last question that I'd like to ask you guys is sort of picking up on, where do we go from here? What are our next steps? What things might you suggest? I mean, these kinds of conversations are vitally important. We need to have more of them. We need to drill down into deeper issues. But for tonight, what are some suggestions for next steps that you might make? And Dr. Williams, you started our panel tonight by saying you felt this responsibility for responding. So what are some suggestions you would make for next steps? What could people do to be active and not just engaged in dialogue?
Well, for me, education is key. And so I would encourage everyone to learn as much as you can about the society or community in which you are a part of, and then how you can help the effort of whatever issues that you see. That's one. So learning everything you can about it. Two, be active in the community as well. I'm a big proponent of talking to the elders, going in the community and talking to community people and seeing what bothers them. What issues are they faced with? What problems do they see in the community? And then using your talents to help assist in whichever way that you can. I will tell people to be cognizant of the political aspects of the society and community that you're in. And how does the political arena impact your community in your area? And then how can you be a part of that too? And then the final part I would say to that's important is that you stay in contact and in touch with your humanity, because that is what's going to guide you. You know, this feeling, this sense of humanness, right? So that you become bothered by everything you see, every instance of injustice, you become bothered by that. And then you work to figure out how you can use your assets or talents to try to address those issues. And so that to me would be my advice for moving forward. so that you'll be in a position so that you are constantly, for the remainder of your life, in a situation where you can bring about change and understand the change that needs to come.
Thank you. Sade, you just said something very powerful, that allyship is the strongest thing that we have and that things are starting to change. What other suggestions would you have or thoughts do you have about what comes next? What comes after this?
Something I've been saying a lot, or I've been talking to my friends a lot and saying this, is the momentum. I think a really important part of this is not letting the momentum die and not just saying, oh, we did a couple protests, a few laws were changed, some people got justice, so let's move on to what's new and what's interesting. We need to build off what we've been doing the last week, the last 2 weeks, and continue to propel forward doing the things we've done. Because as we see, it's been making change. Coming together and using our voices to make change has been working. So definitely momentum. Continue to educate yourself, like Dr. Williams said. There's so many great books, movies, podcasts, things on the internet that you could read and verse yourself in to know about the history of what we're fighting for, and what to do to help use your voice to make change. And like you said, allyship is so important. I feel like if you have the kind of privilege that other people don't, using your privilege to help someone whose voice is not as loudly heard as yours is so important, because as Black people, we're not voiceless, but we tend to have our voices muted or stifled. So if you have the power to speak loud, help other people speak as loud as you can as well.
Thank you for that. Jamie, I liked when you said that this is everyone's struggle. How do you see us moving forward in this struggle that everyone needs to be a part of?
Well, I think it's, as I said earlier, is acknowledging that this is a crisis of humanity right now, recognizing the role of privilege and how that leads to so much responsibility as well, and accountability. But I think one of the most important steps we can take is to listen, to set aside what we think we know, what we think we understand about someone's experience, and just be quiet and listen first. And as has been stated, to research and read and ask questions. But to, again, just set that aside of what you think you know, and what you think you know about yourself too, to challenge yourself, your own bias, and to listen to someone else's experience, to learn about somebody else's story, to put faces and names and experiences and stories to what's going on. I think that's a big step forward we can take in educating ourselves and educating others, and having accountability with the words that we speak, what we listen to, what we read. It might seem small, but not laughing at racist jokes, not spreading stuff on social media that's harmful and that can demean or hurt somebody else. And those might seem like small things, but they have a ripple effect. And we need to be accountable for our actions and what we post and what we say. And I think that's one of the steps among the many amazing other ones that have been listed already.
Thank you for that. Senator, you said that you were really inspired by the movements that you're seeing and heartened by the what you see from young people since the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement in Ferguson, Missouri, to continuing, the persistence of continuing. What would you suggest as some next steps?
Well, the first step for me and for my staff was for us to have a discussion within the staff of my office about these policing issues, about the treatment of the African-American communities here and across the state, with the understanding that each and every one of us has to play a role in bringing about change. And certainly we spent time talking about what we can do as an office and what we can do as individuals. And some of it is, of course, engaging in the communication that is taking place here in El Paso. So some of us, I mentioned that earlier today, I had a conference Zoom meeting with 2 ex-police officers, and trying to get some of their input. And we need to do that across the board, across, you know, all parts of this city, the Northeast, the Segundo Barrio, the West Side, the Upper Valley, Central, where I live. This affects all of us. And each and every one of us has an obligation, a duty, I would say, to engage on the issues that are affecting our families, that are affecting progress in this city. Our discussion has been centered on racism, and there's many ways of looking at that. There are things that are happening in this city right now that some of us would say may be attributed to either intentional racism, or if there is no intent, with racist outcomes. We've had a discussion for a long time about establishing a Mexican-American Cultural Center. And here we are in the 21st century in a city that's almost 85% Latino. We still don't have a cultural center. And when we finally authorized establishing it, the city council came up with only initially $3.7 million, way below what other similar cultural centers are funded at in Albuquerque, in LA, in San Diego, and San Antonio, and so forth. And the latest thing is it's being now relegated to the basement of the public library instead of having a standalone, you know, first-class facility. Some of us think that there is some elements of discrimination in the decisions made regarding that. Same thing with the proposed demolition of Duranguito, the oldest original town site for El Paso, in order to build a sports arena. Why has not that area, and not Segundo Barrio, for example, or Second Ward, been designated as historical neighborhoods the way we have in other parts of town? There's so many things that we can get involved in that are important to the future of this community. And so I think as I said before, I'm inspired and I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic that this time we will have enough people getting involved on different issues and trying to bring about change that is for the better for our community and for our families, for the future of young people. That's, I think our next steps are to continue the discussions, but as I told my staff, it's not enough just to talk. I mean, we got to have some concrete proposals, some ideas, the next steps, as you put it, and to ensure that something positive comes out of this, and that there is, moving forward instead of staying where we've been with these policing issues and other issues.
Thank you to all the panelists for your ideas. I want to add two of my own that are issues that are close to the YWCA's heart. One is fill out your census form. Make sure that you have filled it out and encourage all of your friends and family and neighbors. We need more resources in El Paso. You know, the police shooting of Eric Salas Sanchez here in El Paso was directly related to the lack of mental health resources that we have in the city. And there's so many other resources that we do not have enough of in the city. Filling out your census form is absolutely key to El Paso getting more of those resources so that we can be the strong city that we want to be. My second recommendation is vote. Get registered, make sure all your friends and family, neighbors, students, teachers are registered to vote. Inform yourself on the issues that are on the ballots, on the candidates that are on the ballots. There's no reason not to be very well educated on candidates and issues in this day and age, and make sure that you exercise your right to vote. It's absolutely vital. So I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing their expertise, their wisdom, their lived experience, for being brave and open to these conversations. And I now want to turn it over to Kayla Suarez. Kayla is our communications manager at the YWCA. She is also the person in charge of our racial justice and social equality programs. So over to you, Kayla.
I wanted to thank all of our panelists. Like Dr. Horak said, I am in charge of the empowerment programs at YWCA and communications. So thank you to everybody who attended. There have been some really good questions. I don't know if the panelists have seen all the ones come in. I'll try to get some to you when this is over because they're really great. And like we've said before, this is just a first conversation that we're hoping to have. And it might continue with some of our panelists today because they were so amazing, and different panelists in the future. We do have another event hoping to be similar coming up at the end of June. We'll be announcing soon. So we just ask everybody to follow us on social media, YWCA El Paso, so that we can have continue these conversations, and we can also, you know, share some of our top points that came out of today. So thank you so much for everybody, to our panelists. It was so great. Thank you.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, thank you. It really was
Thank
an
you
honor.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you to the panelists and to all the many participants. And good night to everybody.
Good night.
All right. Good night. Take care.